So our speaker tonight is Anna Guengerich, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Eckerd College. She has conducted archaeological fieldwork in Peru and Bolivia since 2007 and has directed the Tambillo Archaeological Project since 2010. Her research focuses on household architecture and human impacts on high altitude forest environments in South America. And she is also interested in the use of comics, graphic novels, and other visual media in archaeology. And we're really excited to have you here tonight. And I will stop sharing my screen and give you the ability. Thanks.
Thanks. Can everyone see my screen and hear me okay?
Yep.
Is that good, Jamie? Thank you. It has been a little while since I've been online here. All right. So thank you for that introduction. I want to also thank all of you for coming out here tonight remotely. I've got to say I'm a little bit intimidated because I'm new to Southeastern, or rather to Florida archaeology. But I'm excited to be here. I just came to the Tampa Bay area a year and a half ago. So I look forward to building some connections and hopefully getting to see some of you face to face in the near enough future here. For the time being, since we are on Zoom, I want to take the chance to give a little shout out to my mom and dad. Hey there, guys, who have never been able to come to one of my talks before. So I appreciate having you here and my other family members too. All right, so the talk today I've titled Lost Cities of the Cloud Forest, 21st Century Archaeology in the Eastern Andes. And I must admit that in part I chose this title because lost cities tend to be something that always brings people out. So maybe that is working. But that said, in this case, what we're actually talking about here are real lost cities, depending on how you want to define a city. But certainly we're talking about very large, complex, dense settlements that in a real meaningful sense of the term are actually lost to general public knowledge. So as probably many of you are aware, usually people who have lived near sites or whose family have lived near sites for a long time, worldwide, including here in the US, are very familiar with sites so that they're never really lost in a real sense. So the famous discovery of Machu Picchu wasn't so much a discovery since people living near that site had been well aware of it for hundreds of years. But in this case, many sites of the Eastern Andes actually could be considered lost because they are often not generally known by the people who are living in that area. And this is a pretty rare situation in archaeology. A lot of it has to do with the natural environment, which is something that I'm going to be talking about quite a bit tonight, because as you can see from this image down here on the right, many of these sites are densely covered in high altitude rainforest vegetation and basically are invisible to the casual eye, so that people who live in this area would have to spend large amounts of time kind of hacking off jungle vegetation to actually see them. So one of the real pleasures of my research over the years has been to literally uncover these sites alongside people who have lived near here for generations and whose families, who are in some cases the descendants of the people who originally lived here. So it's pretty cool. All right, so the area that I'm going to be talking about today is referred to by a number of different terms. The one that I want to use today is, so we could say the Eastern Andes. What I'm going to use today is the Amazonian Andes, because basically this is a region that runs from northern South America to kind of close to pretty southern South America, from Colombia down through Argentina, along the whole eastern face of the Andes mountain range, which you kind of see over here in brown. And it's sandwiched between the Andes and the Amazon basin. The Amazonian Andes, or the Eastern Andes, are where you find many of the headwaters of Amazonian tributaries. And ecologically, we can think of this as something of an intermediate area between these two broad ecotones, where you have the very high somewhat drier Andes, coming into really close contact with the tropical rainforest of the lowland Amazon basin. And essentially what you get is a very rugged landscape with very sharp drops in altitude over a short east-west extension, and an area that is densely covered by tropical rainforest vegetation, which at this altitude is generally referred to as cloud forest. If anyone has ever been to Machu Picchu, this is located at the far southern end of Peru, whereas the region that I will be concentrating on today, Chachapoyas, is located at the northern end of Peru. But you can think somewhat in a somewhat parallel fashion of the general setting, since Machu Picchu is likewise located in the eastern Andes. So the landscape looks broadly familiar to the Chachapoyas area. So focusing on the environment, which I'll be coming back to periodically throughout the talk, this has really, the way we talk about the environment of the Eastern Andes has dominated how we talk about the Eastern Andes overall. So the environment has played a really prominent role in the history of study here. And this, I could say this extends beyond just archaeology. The Eastern Andes are categorized scientifically as a global biodiversity hotspot, which means that they are characterized by an extraordinarily high rate of biodiversity. And specifically, they're characterized by high rate of endemism for many plant and animal species. What we mean by endemism in this case is that this refers to species that are found in extremely restricted geographical areas and are found nowhere else in the world. So Chachapoyas is famous within Peru for an extraordinarily high number of orchid species, which you can see here up at the top. Hummingbirds, there's also a huge number of hummingbird species that are found here. So these are just two very spectacular examples, but we can talk about a lot of other kinds of species, including tree species as well. A lot of this has to do with the terrain and with the environment. So essentially all of those tributaries of the Amazon that I referred to earlier that have these headwaters in the Eastern Andes are all running broadly to the east, but they're intercutting like truly high altitude mountainous terrain. So what you get are small parcels of areas that are have very specific, very diverse climatological conditions. Throughout, you also get heavy rainfall that has from clouds, from air masses that have been traveling westward from the Atlantic over the Amazon basin. They kind of hit up against the high peaks of the Andean Cordillera and drop all their water on the eastern face. So all of this rain supports really dense and lush vegetation as well, which kind of forms the basis for this great species diversity. In the present, Chachapoyas and other parts of the Eastern Andes are likewise characterized by a number of forces that endanger this really rich natural ecosystem. One of the most significant of which is deforestation. So when you wipe out an endemic species and located in a very restricted area, you wipe out its only habitat. So some of the impacts of land use practices have really severe ramifications. So all in all, part of this label of being a biodiversity hotspot has to do with the fact that this area is at high risk of pretty substantial ecological damage. All right, so that's a bit of the background for the environment, and kind of layered over this environmental background or this environmental substrate, there have been a number of different kinds of myths that talk about people's relationship to the environment of this area. So kind of myths, narratives, different kinds of ways people talk about this region, some of which have a basis in reality, but many of which have been part and parcel of how people have talked about this region for a very long time without actually having any root in reality, as myths go. So part of this comes from European encounters with the Amazon rainforest and with the Eastern Andes, but these actually have roots that predate Europeans and go back to how other societies of South America, especially the Inca, which we'll come to in a moment, have talked about the Eastern Andes. So this area may seem initially at first blush somewhat remote from what we generally talk about when we're talking about Latin America or archaeology. I guess many of you probably have not had a lot of, have not run into the archaeology of the Eastern Andes previously. But to some extent, some of these tropes, some of these mythologies or myths, I should say, are really very widespread in American culture and in Western culture more generally. So you're probably familiar with this area or tropes about this area without actually being aware of it. Part of this has to do with the role of film and kind of adventure stories that have developed in graphic novels and so on over the years. So you may be familiar with, for those of you who are either into art cinema or who were going to movies in the 1970s, may have run into the film Aguirre, The Wrath of God, one of the masterpieces of Werner Herzog, where this movie opens with the conquistadors' doomed party slowly making its way down the eastern face of the Andes into the Amazon proper before they all kind of get decimated over the course of the film. Probably most of you are more familiar with a slightly later film that also heavily popularized this idea of humans in the Eastern Andes and this being a place of danger, kind of hostile to human presence. In the case of the film Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, so the first of the Indiana Jones trilogy, where it opens with this montage that is actually in the script supposed to be set in Chachapoyas, where he's goes and rescues this golden idol, is attacked by kind of cannibal seeming savages upon leaving the temple and makes a narrow escape. So this is actually in the script set in the Eastern Andes, specifically in Chachapoyas, but more broadly, both of these movies in these really pivotal scenes communicate this idea of the Eastern Andes and its environment as a place of danger, a place of hostility, kind of an exotic area characterized by heavy, impenetrable rainforest, by a rugged landscape, and so on. And while these characteristics are actually true, they actually do characterize the environments of the Eastern Andes. So you can see this at, say, the site of Gokta Falls in Chachapoyas. Nevertheless, they also are communicative of outsiders' perceptions of the limits of what humans can do in these kinds of landscapes. So they communicate this idea that these landscapes of the cloud forest are not well suited to basically civilization as we think of it. In reality, though, and more than we'll be talking about today, we do see that there is ample evidence that people were very well suited to inhabiting these areas and thriving in them, just in different ways than we normally expect when we look at ancient societies or pre-modern societies. So I mentioned that some of these narratives have been perpetuated by Western film and entertainment and so on. They may have some of their roots in colonial narratives, but they also predate Westerners. So I'm trying to make a point that this is not an exclusively Western phenomenon, but is more of a general phenomenon wherein people not from this area are looking at this environment and not grasping the full reality of how people inhabited it. So specifically, we know from documents that were recorded by early Spanish colonizers, early Spanish chroniclers who actually encountered the people belonging to the Inca Empire. So we're talking like 16th century, 17th century here. We actually, through these lenses of Inca informants and then the Spanish individuals who wrote them down, who wrote down these narratives, we actually have some sense of how the Inca thought of this landscape. So just to recap for those of you who are not, who might need some brushing up on South American archaeology more generally, the Inca were an expansive empire that arose in the southern highlands the southern highlands of Peru and the Cusco area somewhere in the 1300s. And then from there, they launched a number of different military campaigns, and through combinations of strategy and persuasion and outright conquest, they were able to conquer much of the known world to them, so much of the Andes, by the time that the Spanish arrived on the shores of South America in 1532. So the Inca themselves, much like the later Spanish, conquered peoples, conquered a diverse range of peoples and incorporated them into their empire. And like the Spanish and like other empires throughout history, it served their own interests to perpetuate certain kinds of narratives, certain kinds of stereotypes of the people that they had conquered. Again, much like these other peoples or other empires throughout history, these representations, these stereotypes that they perpetuated tended to be rather negative and tended to focus on the peoples that they conquered as barbaric, as incapable of civilization, incapable of political order in the sense that they represented, such that conquest of these regions was basically doing them a service by bringing them into this broader political order. This is the narrative that we have inherited basically from the Inca through the perspective of Spaniards. And above all, this was the way that the Inca interpreted people of the Eastern Andes. So here you can see an image of a native Andean chronicler who was writing in the 1600s, where you can see kind of his representation of a battle between the Incas over here on the left and these barbaric tribes of the Eastern Andes, such as the Chachapoyas over here on the right, characterized by wild hair, lack of sandals, nose rings, big earrings, and so on. So kind of wild people. This would be one way that the Incas saw people of the Eastern Andes. So this is all well and good and very interesting and whatnot, but also this has left a serious impact on the archaeology of the Eastern Andes. So it's not simply an interesting narrative, but it's actually done damage in how we think about the Eastern Andes and actually how people do research here. So for many years, really up until the 1970s, 1980s or so, archaeologists basically, in a nutshell, didn't really bother to do a lot of work in the Eastern Andes because they figured that there wasn't much there to see. Inheriting these stereotypical views of the Inca, they figured that these were people who basically would not have left impressive remains of what we normally think of as civilization, so why bother? So this has left, kind of put archaeology of this region on the back burner, whereas research in areas such as the Peruvian North Coast have just grown by leaps and bounds in recent decades. Things are only recently, only really in the last couple decades, starting to change, but they have left this really serious, lasting impact that we're trying to get behind, we're trying to catch up on. Sorry, a second. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking a lot about kind of what was going on before the Inca Conquest and what was going on after the Inca Conquest in Chachapoyas. So to give you a little bit more background on that moment of the Inca Conquest and how we talk about it, I want to share a little bit of information here. So the Inca Conquest of the Chachapoyas region took place, as best we know, via radiocarbon dates and recorded chronicles somewhere around 1450 AD. So this was really only about 70 years before the Spanish entered the scene. So it was not a very long period. And to put things succinctly, this didn't go very well for the Inca. They entered the area, they conquered it. As soon as they left, basically the native peoples of Chachapoyas came back, filled in that power void, sort of didn't let Inca administrators do their job. And then several times the Inca had to come back and essentially reconquer the area. So archaeologically, this is expressed in Chachapoyas as a really heavy footprint in terms of architecture and other kinds of material cultures. You see really fine, well-cut styles of Inca architecture here and what otherwise, is kind of a rural area. I think probably in a sense trying to communicate yes, we are here. We are the Inca. Even if we're not really here in presence, we've left our mark on this province. But this overexertion, this attempt to continually reconquer the area, this expenditure of aesthetic elaboration and heavy amounts of labor and the creation of this kind of spectacular material culture here begs the question of why the Inca bothered so much with Chachapoyas if it costs so much work for them to maintain this area and keep it under control. Up to this point, responses to this question have been based more on speculation or models rather than on empirical research in the area, empirical archaeological research, I should say. And most of those explanations have pivoted around this idea that Chachapoyas, like other areas of the Eastern Andes, would have been key nodes in trade routes that connected people of the Andes with people of the Amazon. And these are important because the Amazon, since very, very early prehistoric times, was the source of a number of very important resources for people in the Andes. Some of the most important items were plants, especially hallucinogenic plants or plants with other kinds of medicinal properties, all of which were important for religious ceremonies at the Andes. Among all of these, coca, which you see here on the right, which is vital for being able to work and save energy at high altitudes. This was one of the most important crops going back at least 5,000 years or so. So this was an important resource that the Inca presumably would have wanted to access in the Eastern Andes. Also, other kinds of items would have included brightly colored feathers from the Amazon that would be used for feather work, hardwoods that were used for especially weapons that people used, and a variety of other kinds of products as well. So all in all, in the short answer, how people have responded to why the Inca bothered with the Eastern Andes would have been seeing this region as important home to important trade routes connecting them to this other very distinct environmental region. One of the sites that really contributed to, or that has provided some of the best support, I should say, for this model is the tomb sites of Laguna de los Condores in Chachapoyas. This site was found, it came to light in 1996, and it is probably best known globally for being home to one of the largest caches of mummies that have ever been found in the world. Over 200 mummies were recovered from the tombs here, which you can see on the right. But also from the perspective of an Andean archaeologist was really important because the unusual conditions of preservation allowed for a number of organic materials to preserve without decomposing. And many of these demonstrate very clear links with the Amazon. So over here you can see some ritual staffs that were made out of hard palm wood from the Amazon. Down here is a feathered headdress. Originally would have been a little bit fuller, but you can see a sense of these tropical feathers that would have been highly valued by peoples of the Andes. That said, apart from knowing a little bit about the Inca conquest of Chachapoyas, there are many, many, many questions that remain to be answered. So really, I can't stress enough that archaeology of this entire Eastern Andes region is essentially in its infancy. And hopefully over my lifetime, certainly it's going to spread out in a number of different directions. So I want to give you a little bit of background about what we know about Chachapoyas at this point in time, so that I can move on to what we have learned through my research at the site of Tombio. So the Chachapoyas area was characterized in the pre-Inca period by basically political autonomy. So it's basically subdivided into a number of different sub-regional groups that we might gloss as something along the lines of chiefdoms. So each of these probably would have governed themselves. There were significant cultural differences within this area. archaeologists are very much still in the process of understanding whether those cultural differences mapped onto political organization, such that, say, chiefdoms had their own suites of material culture. We especially see these differences in terms of mortuary treatments, so tomb remains, tomb differences, how the dead were treated. But a lot remains to be done, and in nearly all of these areas, there has been extremely little research done, so it makes it a little difficult to compare. What you see over here on the map, these different color areas represent like areas where, to the best of our knowledge, there seems to be similar shared patterns of material culture, but all of them are grouped within this bigger area known as Chachapoyas, basically based on the facts that when the Inca came, they saw enough similarities between these groups that they clumped them all together in a single imperial province. In addition to this kind of localized political autonomy, within each of these political areas of political governance, there seems to have been some degree of settlement hierarchy with more principal or superior towns, and with smaller villages or towns that were probably connected with them and potentially under their control. But a lot needs to be discovered yet, a lot needs to be studied yet, hence all the question marks that I have over here on the slide. One of the big questions that remains to be studied is to look at chronology. So when I use the term Chachapoyas here, what we're really referring to is this time period prior to Inca Conquest, so roughly between 1100 and 1450 CE. For those who are familiar with Andeanist chronology, this is what we would call the late intermediate period. And we know that people were living here as early as the Pleistocene, and probably living in significant numbers by at least 200 BCE. But this long time period prior to the Chachapoyas period remains virtually unknown. So we know almost nothing about the ethnicity of these groups, of how they organize themselves on the landscape, how they organize themselves politically, and so on. So this basically remains a big blank that hopefully we'll be learning about more down the road. Prior to my team's research, one of the best studied aspects of the Chachapoyas region was mortuary archaeology, and specifically this very distinctive form of mortuary treatment known as cliff tombs. So during this period prior to Inca Conquest, local peoples buried their dead in tombs that were built high in cliff faces. So here you can see an example of what this looks like on the ground, rather on the cliff. There were basically two styles of doing this. One was to build architecture, so actually build masonry tombs within the cliffs. In other parts of the region, people had traditions that more resembled sarcophagi, so human-shaped receptacles made out of an armature of cane with mud and often paint covering them in the form of humans, and they would put mummy bundles inside here. In the past, people presumably, in many of these cases, would have had to climb basically freehand to reach these tombs. And if you imagine the construction of this would have also entailed carrying construction materials on one's back, or even carrying mummy bundles to access these tombs and get them set up in the first place. So we really can't overstate quite how spectacular this cultural accomplishment is. Also, we should note, it really demonstrates a strong familiarity with the landscape and an ability to capitalize on it, to use all of its different components in a way that Western archaeologists would generally be uncomfortable in doing. And likewise, the conquering Inca probably would have had trouble seeing this as a familiar kind of area. Some of you may know Dr. Marla Toyne, who's at University of Central Florida, so kind of a neighbor here to our archaeological community. And she has been one of the main researchers who has been studying this in recent years. over here, you can see a picture of her involved in what she has termed vertical archaeology, which basically entails rappelling down cliff faces to access these tombs. Her work would be one example of a broader pattern in doing research in this area, which is that there are a lot of logistical concerns doing research in cloud forest settings in the Eastern Andes. So I don't want to presume that people in the past would not have been able to thrive in these settings, but I just do want to point out to the fact that this is another one of the reasons, a very real reason, that archaeology has been slow to get going here, because it's difficult to record good, solid scientific data in some of the conditions that we're working in. A lot of this goes back to the fact that it is raining nearly all year round to a greater or lesser degree. So it is not unusual to encounter muddy paths like this. Working in rainproof boots is a must at all times. This entails surveying and covering up a total station with a tarp to protect it from the rain at times. Likewise, strapping up a total station onto horseback to get it up the mountain, and then lots and lots of work with machetes, just trying to clear out the vegetation, say, to be able to record architecture. So this takes a lot of work. When we can finally get LiDAR in this area, it's going to save a lot of time. But where there's a will, there's a way. So we've actually been trying to figure out ways to do this over the years. A large part of the success of our team to date has been due to the involvement of local communities. So I want to flag this since community research has always been an important, or community-based research has always been an important part of my values and how I operate, how my team has been operating. So I'm really looking forward to doing more community outreach and getting to know the local archaeological community here in the Tampa Bay area. In Peru, we are based out of the town of Lemebamba, which is about 5,000 people or so. And since the beginning of the project around 2010, local collaborators have been instrumental in making this work happen, in actually collecting data alongside professionally trained team members. Especially want to call out two individuals who have really been critical in making our work happen over the years, also in working with other research teams too. These being Javier Farge, who is one of the really community elders, I would say, and has really sponsored a lot of study of the past. And also my longtime collaborator, Erin Chavez, who has been working with our team for quite some time and has really made things happen from a logistical perspective too. All right, so prior to the inception of our research project, looking at the area where we work, known as Tombio over here, the bulk of research focused on the Inca period. It also relied heavily on literature or on documents from the colonial period, which for obvious reasons are not great for understanding, for characterizing populations from 200, 500, 1,000 years prior to that. But an important scholar who really set the groundwork for future research in the central Chachapoyas area was Danish archaeologist Inga Schellerup. She did her work primarily in the 1980s and 1990s, although she's still doing work in surrounding areas. Her work focused on Inca occupation of the area, looking at and recording Inca settlements and how they fit into the broader regional infrastructure. And also she did a little bit of work on terrace agriculture, which is a topic that my team is taking back up now, that we're going to be pursuing more in the future. But this was basically the state of what we knew of the central Chachapoyas area when we started our research in 2010. So The project, my research project, has taken place since that time at a complex of sites that were probably interlinked, which I have given the term Tambillo, since this is generally how people in this area refer to this general area. All of these sites that make up Tambillo are located between 2,500 to 3,500 meters above sea level. To put this in perspective, the city of Denver is around 1,600 meters above sea level. So we're talking over 2 times as high as the city of Denver. So this is a very high altitude location. One of the main characteristics of the Tumbio site complex is that it is made up of a series of, depending how you count them, approximately 10 discrete sites that are all located on separate mountain peaks, which ring basically kind of a flat, a flat pampa or a flat kind of mesa top over here. And also flank this series, this conjunction of 2 rivers, the Atuen River and the Tambillo River. So here you can see these sites outlined in cross-hatched yellow. Over here you can get a view of what they actually look like on the ground. And it's important to stress here that even though they are separated by deep gorges that descend to the river about 500 meters and then require reascending, they are actually very closely clustered as the crow flies, and in fact, heavily intervisible. So people in this area would undoubtedly have been in close interaction with each other, even if they weren't necessarily seeing each other on a day-to-day basis. One of the distinctive features of Tambillo, which is characteristic of the broader Chachapoyas area, is that settlements are located on mountaintops, hilltops, and ridgetops. So here you can see a number of other Chachapoyas sites. None of these are maps that I made. Over here is the site of Montevideo, which is where I did my dissertation work. So you can see it's kind of laid out at the juncture of 2 different ridges. These sites are made up of circular stone architecture, and they kind of often have this elongated pattern where they're strung out along the hilltops. All right, so for those of us who are Westerners, we generally don't associate mountaintops with being extremely habitable places. And generally when I give talks to the public, to colleagues, to students, one of the questions I inevitably get is why people are building on mountaintops. One answer that archaeologists often give to this is to say that it was for defensive reasons. So when you're up on a mountaintop, you can clearly see attackers approaching. But in the case of Chachapoyas, despite the warlike reputation that the Inca fomented about these people, there's actually not much evidence of conflict or interpersonal conflict or conflict between villages, say in the forms of arms discovered in the archaeological record or in terms of skeletal remains. So this pushes us to basically rethink these assumptions about mountaintops and why people might have lived here. So a lot of my research since beginning to work here has been to think about this and basically kind of inverting the question and saying, well, why do we assume in the first place that mountaintops are not habitable places? And in fact, when you think about this, there are a lot of advantages in this area for why you might live on a mountaintop instead of a flat area. So let me scoot back here. Now, when you look at the landscape of Tumbio, for starters, there is not a lot of flat open area. What flat area there is runs along the riverbed, so it would be prone to flooding at times. So that's not really there in the first place for people to live, for people to choose to inhabit. That said, we can actually look at positives of living on mountaintops. So one of the positives would be visibility, not for defense, but for just getting a sense of who was traveling up and down the river, maybe for purposes of trade or exchange or other forms of transit. Also, being up on a mountaintop would allow you to interact and see and potentially even communicate with your neighbors. So take the site of Montevideo here and the site of Cuchaconga. People could potentially whistle and hear each other across this chasm or send smoke signals, something of that nature, because conch-shell trumpet, which are found in other parts of the Andes. So this might have actually facilitated communication rather than having people lower down slope. This would have kept people out of the way of landslides, which are a constant issue in this region. So it's an area that experienced a very severe earthquake about a month ago, I believe. So that was an issue people would have dealt with in the past. And also for anyone that has spent any time in mountainous regions, you know that in the morning and in the late afternoon, shadows get really long if you're in the valley. So by being located on top of ridges, people would have had more hours of daylight, and just as importantly, their crops would have had more hours of daylight and warmth in a pretty cold climate. So I would actually argue, and I've argued, that there were a number of advantages to this kind of settlement pattern, and rather than coming to the table by assuming that the kinds of landscapes that seem intimidating or inhabitable to us were also intimidating and uninhabitable to people in the past, we might actually pause, come at it with a blank slate and look at how people were living and in what kinds of environments in the past. So clearly people of Chachapoyas were making this landscape work for them, just as they were taking these cliff tombs and making these cliffs work for them as a way of expressing their ideas about death. In addition to looking at settlement organization at what we might call the urban scale, or kind of urban organization, I could say, our research has also attempted to create population estimates for this area. In a nutshell, this has consisted of walking around on foot through these sites with machetes and hacking off vegetation as needed, with an eye to not damaging architecture, so doing this carefully. But this is about cutting down a lot of vegetation just to kind of walk through these sites in the first place. And with that in mind, creating a count of buildings that we have found. So through excavation, we have ascertained that the overwhelming majority of these circular buildings were houses. So these were domestic spaces. And over the years, through a lot of sweat and blood and rain and so on, we have counted a total of 1,460 of these structures. These were distributed according to sites in this kind of pattern. So for those of you who are familiar with settlement hierarchies, you'll see that we don't really see a multi-tiered system. We see more of a graduated distribution of site numbers. But we do see definite differences in the sizes of sites, which I would say do indicate some degree of distribution of power at the local level by site. So particularly the site of La Jolla is the largest. It has the finest architecture. So it probably played a role as kind of a principal town within the settlement cluster. By estimating approximately 5 to 7 people living within each of these houses, just based on general space requirements cross-culturally, I've estimated pretty conservatively that altogether these sites would have been home to somewhere around 7,000 to 10,000 people at their heyday. And this number may sound somewhat low by modern standards, but for the ancient Andes, this absolutely would have qualified as a city. So again, this raises questions about what we actually mean by a city if these people were all closely interacting, probably on a weekly, if not a daily basis. Yet this population was distributed between these very villages. Also, this kind of population estimate raises the question of sustainability and how this many people would have supported themselves in a high altitude setting that poses a lot of challenges for human habitation, admittedly. So I'm going to come back to that question of environmental impacts, which is something that more of a direction that we'll be going as we continue our research. Now, one of the really outstanding aspects of this area is the architectural preservation. So far, I have stressed how vegetation makes it difficult to work here, how vegetation has shaped preconceptions about the environment and how people relate to it. But the vegetation, this lush cloud forest vegetation, also has the fabulous advantage of contributing to really extraordinary preservation of architecture. So the building that you see here on the right at the site of Montevideo dates back about 800 years ago. And it is so well preserved that you can literally walk on this jutting ledge, this cornice that extends out. So walk around from the side and enter the building through its original house, through its original doorway. This kind of preservation of domestic architecture is extremely rare in the archaeological record, really worldwide. Houses often do not preserve well. Other than in cases like Pompeii, they're usually some of the first buildings to go when people reuse sites. So this really presents a wonderful opportunity to study the choices that ancient architects made when they built their houses, to look at what broader traditions of vernacular architecture. And this would be one of the best preserved suites of domestic architecture, certainly from anywhere in the ancient Andes, potentially anywhere within the ancient Americas. Over here, you can see one of the several reconstructed houses that have been partially rebuilt in recent decades. This one is from the site of Cuelap, and it gives you a sense of how most archaeologists working in this region have modeled what roofs probably would have looked like. They probably had this really tall conical structure that would have facilitated the runoff of rainwater and keeping them intact for potentially decades at a time. So houses in Chachapoyas are not only well preserved, but their preservation has enabled us to talk about how elaborate they are, how they really are architectural accomplishments even in and of themselves, in the sense that archaeologists tend to usually talk about for monumental civic architecture, so public kinds of buildings such as temples or palaces. One of the interesting aspects of Chachapoyas built environments or Chachapoyas settlements is actually that there were very, very few buildings of that kind. So there were very few buildings that served any function. How do I put this? There are very few buildings whose function was exclusively non-domestic. So buildings that would not. And this is something that we don't normally associate. I'm sorry, it looks like I have an internet issue. Can you hear me? Am I okay, Jamie?
Yeah, you broke up for just the last sentence you said.
Okay. Yeah, so this kind of distribution of architecture is somewhat rare for the ancient Andes. This kind of lack of public buildings and instead the seeming investment in private residences. So looking at this, I have argued that basically the labor, the concern that people in many ancient societies invested in public buildings as kinds of expressions of community identity or places where people would come together for gatherings, that this was not really manifested at Chachapoyas settlements. And this may in part have been due to the environment. So when you're living on a ridgetop, there's not a lot of open space for really large public buildings. But that said, we can posit that it probably would have had significant impacts on how people led their lives and how they came together as a community, how they thought of themselves. This is actually something that I've, strangely enough, been rethinking with the pandemic, where many of us have lost these spaces of gathering, these shared places that unify us, and we have had to find ways to do that within our own homes. So things like having church services over Zoom or classes over Zoom and so on. So this seems to be more going in the lines of ancient Chachapoyas. Obviously they didn't have Zoom, but still this ways in which people would connect, not by big public gatherings, but say perhaps going to each other's houses to visit or have small religious ceremonies. In addition to thinking about the organization of space more generally, our research has done a lot of work in recording differences in architecture. This includes some really distinctive features that are unique to Chachapoyas within the Andes, particularly this really beautiful kind of geometric mosaic known as a frieze that come in several different varieties in different parts of Chachapoyas. So this seems to be one of these areas where people in different regions were expressing kind of microcultures. And we have also very carefully documented the distribution of masonry quality, ranging from very, very crude, barely modified stones to very fine, almost brick-like masonry. And here in the middle, you can see a really exceptional example. So I suggest that these quite likely correlated to differences in status within these communities. One last area of research that represents something we've been working on in the last couple of years and has been on a bit of a hiatus because of the pandemic, but is going to be more of a direction that will be going on once we resume, is looking at agricultural infrastructure, and specifically at a kind of infrastructure that was widespread throughout the ancient Andes and really many parts of the world, which is agricultural terracing. So classically, when we talk about terracing in traditional settings, it often entails creating terraces out of steep hill slopes. Often these are faced with rock, such as in this schematic diagram of Inca style terracing. And then people would grow essentially on beds that they created on these flat surfaces. Terracing has a lot of technological advantages in places like the Andes. Partly it helps control temperature, so crops can stay warmer depending on what temperature they're grown at. But one of the main features is that it's generally used to facilitate irrigation, to control scarce water in areas such as the Inca heartland and get it to crops, particularly the Inca's most prized crop, maize or corn. So surrounding the sites, the settlement sites of Tombio, we have documented an extraordinary amount of terracing in areas that are somewhat flatter than the settlements themselves, but generally still very steep areas. And one of the distinctive features of these terraces is that they are made of earth. There are almost no stone components other than these like tall kind of probably pathways that led up the slope, and in other cases, there are no stone components at all. So they're actually made of earth. Basically, they have this layout of very tall earthen berms around 6 feet high, interspersed with these parallel lines running up the slope behind them. My collaborator, Stephen Berquist, and I collected aerial imagery of many of these terraced areas, and then Stephen processed this into a GIS model where we were able to recreate the topography and then use digital tools to model how water would have flown over these terraces. And essentially what he encountered by analyzing the model was that that these very large berms probably served to kind of back water up to stall its progress over the ground surface, basically controlling it. And if you think back to the fact that this is an area that is characterized by heavy rainfall, this would have been a really important technology in preventing erosion over the landscape and protecting crops. So what seems to be going on here is that people were actually using locally distinctive forms of terracing to prevent the accumulation of water, to actually manage water and facilitate drainage, rather than to irrigate the crops, which would not have been necessary in this kind of environment. So this looks in some ways similar to terracing in other areas, but actually played a really different function that made a lot of sense in terms of local landscapes. Also, one of the particular ones here you can see is a sinkhole that is terraced. So similar to Florida geology, this area is made out of limestone, and water would have been kind of funneled in to crops that were grown within the terrace. I realize that we're running short on time, so I'm going to run through this really quickly. This research has raised some questions about who was using the terraces and when they were created. Specifically, one thing that we want to look at in future research is whether they were created by the Inca or whether they predated the Inca and were a locally developed technology or agricultural technology. We have also collected samples from 3 different terrace areas and found phytoliths from maize. Maize is not supposed to be able to be grown at this altitude, and nowadays farmers would not dare to grow maize at this altitude. They grow potatoes in this area. So that raises the question of, one, how maize was being grown in this area at that time. Were there different climatic conditions? Were people growing particular land races of maize? Was it something about the technology of water management in the terraces? These are some issues that we're going to be looking at down the road. But coming back to the original question about myths and narratives about Chachapoyas, this also challenges that idea that this was really kind of only a stopping place for the Inca, that they were really only looking at the Eastern Andes as a place to move across and get those valued goods from the Amazon. And it raises the idea that they may have actually been exploiting this area in and of itself and developing it on a really large scale to grow valued crops such as maize. So if we can ascertain better what's going on here, this could have really important implications for how the Inca thought about the Eastern Andes and also about their impacts on local environments. So one thing we're going to be looking at as we develop our research is at impacts on the extent of local forests and also on how people were using local forests, whether they were changing the kinds of trees that they exploited for firewood or for other kinds of purposes after the Inca Conquest, or whether even we might actually see evidence of agroforestry or efforts to preserve forests, which some colleagues have found potential evidence for in the Cusco area with the rise of the Inca. So there's a lot of remaining questions, but these kinds of questions in looking at human impacts on the environment after the Inca Conquest compared to before the Inca Conquest should provide really valuable information for understanding how people are impacting these biodiverse and fragile and definitely threatened environments in the present. So to sum up some of what we found out, our research confirms without a doubt that the Eastern Andes were not an area that was backward, that was uncivilized, that was characterized by political disorder, as the Inca argued and as Spanish settlers argued after them, but rather these were densely settled areas that had many of the hallmarks that we would traditionally associate with complex advanced societies, what we generally think of as quote unquote civilizations. So we should be moving past these harmful stereotypes perpetuated originally by the Inca and actually looking at these contexts in and of themselves. Also, this should be apparent by this time, but it behooves us at this point to look back to the past and at human impacts on the environment, also at how people were using the environment in potentially sustainable ways to inform how we manage the environment in the present. So things like policy making, things like working with communities at the local level, et cetera. And wanted to spend a little more time tying this back into Florida archaeology, because I know that many of our presenters have looked at this question in a more regional context. But let me just leave off here by saying that people have been looking at this question around the world. So I think, looking at it from a lot of different regional histories will just only enrich our perspectives. So I'll wrap it up there for tonight. Just want to briefly gesture to the many people who have made this work possible over the years, the funding institutions. And I know we don't have much time for questions. So if anyone wants to talk with me more about this research, I would love to. You can find my email here, which I will leave up on the screen, and I will leave off there for now. Jamie, would you like to take over at this point?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. That was awesome. And it seems like there's so many interesting questions arising from all of your recent field work. So just thanks again. And we do have some questions in the chat that I can go ahead and ask you. Um, the first from Jennifer Duzer, sorry if I mispronounced that. Will LiDAR be effective with the slopes involved? And will this be ground-based LiDAR or aerial?
Yeah, so that's a great question. LiDAR is very much in its infancy. I have some colleagues that have tested it out using aerial LiDAR at this point. No one has done any ground-based LiDAR yet. There have also been some studies of aerial LiDAR in similar areas where the slope did seem to cause some issues. So I would say that this is a space for experimentation and innovation to try to figure this out. Basically what it'll do is to be able to identify sites and map them very, very quickly, saving weeks of work that we're currently doing with the total station, which is very, very difficult. So to be seen, basically.
Yeah, LiDAR just makes everyone's lives a lot easier.
Right.
Alan asked a question before you were talking about the terraces. He was interested if there's evidence of aqueducts or other constructed water features. Are the water features you're talking about on the terraces the only evidence you have?
Let me think about that. There is certainly no evidence of canals, which are common in drier parts of the highland Andes, especially in conjunction with irrigated terracing. In terms of other kinds of water hydrological infrastructure, that is what comes to mind off the top of my head. There's other parts of the Andes where dams have been like pre-Columbian dams have been recorded. No one has recorded any dams in the Chachapoyas region. So yeah, so really there hasn't at this point, no one has really recorded any other kinds of hydrological infrastructure other than the terraces.
Okay, thank you. And Sue Lewis asked, sand ceremonials, oh, sorry, I just got another question, so bumped it up. Sand ceremonial structures, was there any evidence of their religion?
Yeah. So a lot, okay. Yeah, so the best evidence for that comes from the site of Cuelap, which I have not talked about at all. That is one of the better studied sites, so you can find information out there. There has been research going on at Cuelap for a long time, much of which has not been published, which is unfortunate. But if you look into it and the publications that are there, there is a lot of evidence for ritual activity at that site, going way back much before that Chachapoyas period after 1100 CE or so. So there are human offerings, there are llama offerings, and especially there is this structure that is completely unique in South America. It's known as the tintero. It kind of has this form of an inverted truncated cone. So it's basically like wider at the top than the bottom, and it is circular. And at the center is this deep pit that was that had various kinds of offerings that were placed in it. Largely, though, there's not a lot of material that has been recovered from it. So it's a baffling structure that is really poorly understood, but it was part of a whole area where there was a lot of evidence for ritual activity, kind of at one of the high points of the site of Cuelap. So within the whole broader area of Chachapoyas, that's one of the best contexts that we have. A lot of my research has been within households, so we certainly see evidence for household-based ritual activity. So in some ways, you could say that we have a better handle on that at this point. So you see a lot of evidence of offerings particularly offerings that were built into the floor before new floors were laid down. In the case of my sites, people would take like a jar and then very carefully break off the neck and then flip it and set that on the old floor before building a new one. So not a real spectacular kind of ritual, but it was clearly a really important thing that people did, probably to kind of sanctify their house as they embarked on a new kind of life stage in the house's life over time. But in other areas of Chachapoyas, I mentioned how diverse the area is. You can actually see people who were buried under the house floors, probably say like the heads of the household were buried there, or potentially mummy bundles that had been buried elsewhere were taken from their original context and buried in the floor. So obviously there would have been very heavy religious aspects to burying your relatives in your home. So there's a good bit of data amongst very recent emerging research about household ritual in terms of things like understanding the deities people worshipped. There's not a lot we can say about that other than that in pretty much all of the pre-Columbian Andes and in a lot of places today, people basically saw the landscape as alive. So they saw things like rocks in particular as being animate or being persons that they could interact with, that they would need to leave offerings for. So that was probably the case in Chachapoyas too. So it's kind of a long answer, but like pulling together the best of our knowledge at this point in time.
Great, thank you. We have a few more questions. Dennis Pearson would like to know, how did they make mummies in a humid rainforest, cloud forest environment?
These are good questions. Yeah, so the mummies that have been preserved are from caves and from cliff tombs. So actually probably have a greater proportion of burials coming from like natural caves than from cliff tombs at this point in time. So caves are probably the best place where people were preserving mummies. And if you look at like the best resource to find out more about that would be that site Laguna de los Condores that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Write that in the chat if you're interested. So there's actual some bioarchaeological research on preservation techniques that involved like removing the entrails and so on, but probably just keeping them dry. They would have been indoors or in cave shelters where we do get good preservation.
Thank you. Nancy White left a comment that says, we've shown Lost Warriors of the Clouds in classes for years with Sonia Gielan. Is she still around? And also, random thought, the zigzag architecture that you were talking about on the buildings resembles those at Great Zimbabwe. Have you noticed that before, or have you made that connection? And she said, fabulous work, great talk, thank you.
Great, thank you. And if you want to have any more resources for your class, just reach out. I'd be happy to share more. Regarding the first question, yeah, so that actually a lot of the work at Laguna de los Condores is by Sonia Guillen. So she's most definitely still around. She was briefly the Minister of Culture in Peru. So she's moving and shaking. So a lot of her colleagues are doing some of the hands-on research at this point. But she is very much still active in the field and a good person to consult about the bioarchaeological work, or Marla Twain would be a good person also. Great Zimbabwe, yes. A number of people have commented on this. Sadly, there is no evidence that has ever been found in the Andes for contact with ancient Africa. But in terms of thinking about monumental architecture by societies that don't qualify as states, I think there's a lot of value in comparisons with a number of ancient African polities. So finding out about that connection actually tipped me off to reading a lot of research about ancient Africa. So that has been really valuable. And if people aren't familiar with Great Zimbabwe, it's a really fascinating site. So I'd point them that way too. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And Dot Moore asked a question that I was thinking: were there domesticated animals kept in these habitation areas of the sites? I was thinking a cuy is potentially one, right?
Mhm. Yes, so we have found evidence for cuy, for guinea pigs, from Inca occupation periods at some of the sites. We have not recovered any cuy remains from the pre-Inca period. So that seems like that might be a case where we see the introduction of new species. We haven't really done a lot of work on that. Nowadays, people do raise cuy, and yes, they stay in their houses. So if you stay in rural houses, you'll hear a lot of cute little bubbly noises of the cuys running around. Primarily, though, people were raising camelids, that is llamas and alpacas, prior to and after Inca Conquest. So something on the order of 95% or more of the faunal assemblages that we recovered were camelid. So people were raising a lot of camelids. And no one has ever identified any corrals. So we can't specifically say whether they were indoors or outdoors, but by analogy, they were presumably out in some of these more like higher altitude portions of the landscape where you can grow crops. So kind of taking advantage of these different ecological niches by altitude. So yeah, absolutely, we're relying on animals in their diet.
Great, and I'll just ask you one last question. Dennis Pearson would like to know, so what happened to the people in the Chachapoya? Were they eliminated by diseases or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was a vibrant population when the Inca arrived. It continued to be a very large population throughout the Inca period. Kind of interesting side note, when the Spanish arrived, they actually traveled up to the highlands at the city of Cajamarca, which was very close to Chachapoyas, and that was where the Inca emperor was captured. So the Chachapoy were actually some of the first to show up to try to get the Spanish to help them. So volunteering their help to the Spanish to throw off the yoke of the Inca. Obviously that didn't really go well for them over the long term. And pretty much every other native population of the Americas, their populations finally were really decimated by Spanish diseases and to some extent Spanish maltreatment of people during the colonial period. So there was a truly massive plunge in population, something on the order of 70 to 90% of the population disappeared within the next century after Spanish conquest. I don't know the exact day, but many parts of the Andes, finally the populations kind of rose again by the 1800s or so. So today there are definitely people that are still living in this region. Some of them are descendant from the original Chachapoyas people with Inca mixed in, with Spanish mixed in, but it is an area where people have maintained a number of cultural traditions going back to the Chachapoyas period.
All right, thanks. And just to maybe make that, I guess, a little less depressing, let's not end on that note. As Sue Lewis did say, I wish I'd heard you before I went to Machu Picchu, and I have a lot more questions to ask my tour guide. Great talk. A lot of good compliments in the chat. And I just wanted to thank you again for your time and for sharing your research with us. We learned a lot. And yeah, I can't wait to kind of keep track of the future research and the environmental stuff that you're doing, and maybe some maps when you get aerial LiDAR.
Great, thank you, and look forward to interfacing more with you down the road too, with all of you.
All right,
Thank
thanks.
you.